There's no argument that Jim Wolfensohn has led an extraordinary life. Born in Depression Australia to Jewish immigrants from Europe, he represented his country as an Olympic fencer before carving out a very successful life as a banker in England and then America. A consummate networker, he was probably the best connected Australian in the US for decades. Prime ministers sought his help. President Bill Clinton sponsored him into the World Bank presidency in 1995, where for 10 years he sought to reform the bank from within, making it more responsive to the world's poorest nations. In 2005, President George W. Bush personally recruited him as special envoy to the Middle East for the quartet of America, Russia, the European Community and the UN. But in his autobiography called A Global Life, Jim Wolfensohn says the Americans then proceeded to chop him off at the knees. He's in Sydney to promote his book, and I spoke with him earlier today. Jim Wolfensohn, I'd like to focus mainly on your personal experience as George W. Bush's hand-picked choice as special envoy of the quartet to the Middle East, the US, Russia, the European Union and the UN.
Right.
Because in your book you suggest a cynicism behind your appointment that over time cut the ground from under you. Now, before we get to the detail of that, can you just briefly explain what you set out to achieve in that job?
Well, I was asked by the quartet to try and assist in two things. The first one was the immediate issue of the withdrawal from Gaza. And the second was to try and see if that could be extended to a resolution of the issues in the West Bank, so that ultimately there could be the much sought-after two-state solution. And the reason that I was asked to do it was to make sure that initially the Gaza withdrawal took place satisfactorily.
And very much a part of your intent was to try to help secure some kind of economic underpinning for the future of the West Bank and Gaza, so that the Palestinian community as a separate state would actually have some chance of establishing itself.
Well, the immediate issue then was to make sure that Gaza could survive. And there were a number of things associated with that. You needed to have some sort of industry in Gaza. And there were two things which suggested themselves. One was tourism, because it has a wonderful coastline. And the other was agriculture, because there were greenhouses there that were left by arrangements which we made by the Israeli settlers. And so it looked as though you could have a Gaza that was financially and economically stable. And the second part was that there was agreement for a linkage between Gaza and the West Bank, with the ability for people to travel between the Gaza and the West Bank. And there was also a plan which was announced by Condi Rice for an airport, for a port in Gaza, which gave them the possibility of access not only to the West Bank, but to the rest of the world.
You felt you were making real progress on a number of fronts. You won significantly more money from the G8 for economic aid for the Palestinian Authority. You were breaking down Israeli barriers to the flow of trade in and out of Gaza and the West Bank. You had built a rapport with both Israeli and Palestinian leaderships. But at a critical point, when you asked for backup from US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, you felt that you were essentially cut off at the knees. Now, what happened?
Well, I think several things happened. The first thing was that Ariel Sharon, shortly after the withdrawal, got sick for a first time, and then, as you know, became permanently incapacitated. So that took away the leader on the Israeli side. The second thing was that I don't think the Americans ever were totally committed or convinced that the opening of Gaza would be a peaceful activity, and unfortunately they were assisted in coming to a contrary view by the fact that you had an outbreak of violence in Gaza towards Israel.
But during those talks, when Condi Rice was there in the Middle East, you were so angry at being, when you realised you were being
very angry.
When you realised you were being cut out of the process with Condi Rice, the Palestinians and the Israelis, that you told Secretary Rice that you were resigning.
I did, that night, exactly. And I said that I wasn't there as a token. I was there. I'd worked very hard to try and bring about a sense of confidence on both sides, and I was trusted by both sides. When those negotiations were going on, I was sitting with the Palestinians and really keeping them calm because they were friends of mine. I'd worked with both sides, and unfortunately, I think there was a very different axis between the United States and Israel about what was going to happen, what the outcome was going to be. So I told Condi that I was out at 10 o'clock that night, and she said, no, you can't get out. And so we worked till 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was more or less in the discussions and was there then with the head of the European Union to try and make an announcement at 7 or 8 the next morning that we had this agreement about the airport, the port, the linkage between Gaza and the West Bank, all of which sounded great, but which very sadly never happened.
Well, in fact, you say with that agreement, the Condi Rice and the Israelis subsequently took it apart piece by piece.
That's correct. But the reason that they gave for that was the outbreak of violence which occurred by some extremist Palestinians and some extremist Israelis who were to be found in the military who responded. And the sense of goodwill which we'd hoped for to build a peaceful working relationship certainly didn't happen. And
left you nowhere to go.
That was at the moment when Arik Sharon got sick. And if Arik had been around, I think things could have been different, but he wasn't.
Now, the job collapsed for you in April 2006. You walked away.
Yes.
But in October, Kofi Annan asked you to take up the cudgel again and become special envoy again to the Quartet.
Right. With the support of the United States, that offer was made.
But you obviously were a little bit mistrusting of that support because you had a conversation with Condi Rice, asked her some pertinent questions, and as a result of her answers, you then declined the offer.
Well, the key question was, would I be kept informed about what the United States was doing? Because after the previous experience, it was very clear to me that there was a direct dialogue between the United States and the Israelis. And if you weren't part of that, you had really no chance of being central to what was going on. And I warned my successor, Tony Blair, of that issue, and I'm afraid Tony is suffering in the same way.
But the second question you asked related to your own security. Would you have the same security arrangements backed by the United States as you had last time, and she wasn't even prepared to do that?
They were not prepared to do that, but the Brits were prepared to do it. But I thought it was ridiculous to have British security in the United States, but I never got round to arguing it because the other issue was much more important.
So, on the one hand, the United States wanted you back in the game, but they didn't.
I believe that to be the case. I believe the Quartet wanted me back, and the US went along with it because I hadn't done anything wrong. And then they appointed Tony Blair on the same limited terms that I was fighting against. So I think, honestly, the United States never took the Quartet seriously. I think the issue was that they were conducting the negotiations with the Israelis, and the Quartet was a camouflage.
So when you warned Tony Blair to read the fine print, what did he say?
Well, he tried to get an expanded mandate, which unfortunately he never got. So he has been part of the economic process, but not part of the political process.
So
and I think he misses that.
Do you think he's doomed to the same failure that you were?
Well, if he's happy with an economic mandate, then he's okay. But you should ask him, but I would be surprised if he felt that his talents were being adequately used in terms of the peace process.
But isn't the success of the economic mandate contingent on the success of the political mandate?
Very
Aren't they absolutely interrelated?
Very significantly. But it is possible to contemplate having economic advances, as there are very significantly today in the West Bank. In the West Bank, there is very close cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian companies. What is being left out is, of course, Gaza. For a variety of reasons, the most obvious of which is the political and the threat that Gaza poses, not just to the Israelis, but also to a united Palestine.
As somebody who takes the whole issue of peace in the Middle East extremely seriously, there are aspects to that saga that must have left you feeling sick in the stomach.
They did, and I'm very worried now because I think we're at the last stage of trying to get a negotiated agreement now. And I worry very much that if the current discussions collapse, I think there isn't the energy around for looking at getting everybody focused on this issue for quite some time, and I fear the consequences could be substantial violence.
You say that in the end the Israelis and the Palestinians are 11 million people in a sea of 350 million Arabs, and that they need to understand they are not the most important regional issue. What are you saying? What's the message?
Well, I think the most important regional issues are the split between the Sunnis and the Shias, and obviously the issue of Iran. which dominates everything. And I think that the 11 million people have had a lot of prominence, get a lot of prominence in the press. But really, it's relatively a small issue. The issue of Jerusalem is a very important issue emotionally, but the issue of the 11 million, where frankly my experience was that no one particularly likes the Jews, no one particularly likes the Palestinians. But that's a very personal comment which probably shouldn't be on television, but it is what I believe.
Can we turn briefly to another issue?
Please.
As someone steeped in America's banking culture and financial system, can you see an end in sight to America's economic woes?
I think America for the next 5 years is likely to have maybe a 2% average growth rate, which is not much growth. And I think that there are fundamental issues in the United States which can't be answered simply about the United States. What is happening in the world is that you're having a huge move towards a resurgence of power in Asia, which we haven't seen since the early 1800s. And after the war, China and India were 1.5% of global GDP. By 2050, they're likely to be 45% of global GDP. This is an enormous shift in the world's power, so that 65% of all GDP in the world will be in Asia. We've been used to a world, when I grew up, and you grew up, that it was the United States, Europe, and Japan that were 80% of the world's GDP. That group will be 35% of the world GDP by 2050.
Do you think America is well equipped, either psychologically or politically, to deal with that shift in power and in affluence that you're describing?
I think at the moment the U.S. is, I regret to say, in a sad situation at the moment, and it's very tough for the president. You'll see the reaction of the people in the next election as they try to throw people out. And I think what is needed is an understanding in the U.S. jointly between the Republicans and the Democrats that they've got to come together to get the country moving in the direction which is obvious, without having what is currently happening, party politics playing a role, and indeed even a third party, which is the Tea Party group. So it's a very difficult moment, I think, in the United States at this minute. I have enormous faith in the country and in the intelligence and in the university system and in research, but I think it's fair to say that it's in very tough shape at the moment.
Jim Wolfensohn, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you.